February 1959, 9 experienced hikers set off into the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union. They never came back. When rescue teams finally found them weeks later, what they discovered made no sense. The tent had been cut open from the inside. The hikers were scattered across the snow, some up to a kilometer from camp. Several were found in their underwear, in temperatures of minus 30 degrees. One had her tongue missing. 2 had fractured skulls. Another had broken ribs so severe that investigators compared the force to a car crash. And yet, there were no signs of a struggle. No footprints from anyone else. No avalanche. No animal attack. The Soviet government closed the case and classified the files for 30 years. Their official conclusion? An unknown compelling force. This is the Dyatlov Pass incident. And 70 years later, we still don't have a definitive answer. To understand what happened on that mountain, you first need to understand who these 9 people were, because they weren't amateurs. Igor Dyatlov was 23 years old, a physics student at the Ural Polytechnical Institute, and an experienced hiker who had led over a dozen expeditions. He was meticulous. He was careful. His friends called him the best in the group. The team he assembled for this trip reflected that standard. There were 8 other students, 7 men and 2 women, all experienced, all physically fit, all trained for exactly this kind of winter expedition. Several had completed Grade 2 hiking certifications, the Soviet equivalent of a serious mountaineering qualification. Their destination was Odotin, a peak in the northern Ural Mountains. The route was graded as Category 3, the highest difficulty level. It was ambitious, but for this group, it was achievable. They left the city of Sverdlovsk on January 23, 1959. Their plan was to reach Otterton, plant a flag, and return by February 12th. On February 12th, when no telegram arrived confirming their return, nobody panicked. Expeditions ran late. Weather caused delays. It was normal. By February 20th, 8 days after their expected return, the first search party was sent out. What they found would shock the entire Soviet Union. The search team found the abandoned tent on February 26th on the slopes of a mountain called Kolotsiakhl. In the Mansi language, the indigenous people of that region, Kolotsiakhl means dead mountain. The tent was partially buried in snow. It had been pitched correctly with equipment neatly stored inside. Food, spare clothing, diaries, camera equipment, but the entrance was sealed shut from the outside. The tent had been cut open from the inside with multiple long slashes running down the fabric. Someone had been desperate to get out. Desperate enough that they didn't bother with the door, and then they ran. The search team followed the footprints in the snow, 9 sets heading away from the tent, down the slope toward the tree line. The prints were staggered. Some were the prints of bare feet, others showed socks or a single boot, in minus 30-degree temperatures, in the dark, running away from their own shelter. At the tree line, under a large cedar tree, they found the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. Both were dressed only in their underwear. Their hands were burned. They had tried to make a fire, apparently tearing branches from the cedar tree with their bare hands. The branches were torn as high as 5 meters up the tree, suggesting one of them had climbed it, possibly to look back toward the tent. Both had frozen to death. Moving back up the slope from the tree line, the team found 3 more bodies. Igor Dyatlov himself was found 300 meters from the cedar tree, frozen mid-crawl, facing back toward the tent, as if he had been trying to return. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found nearby, face down in the snow. Rustem Slobodin was between them, a small fracture in his skull, though not considered fatal. All 3 had died of hypothermia. That was 5 bodies. There were 4 more to find. Those 4 would take another 2 months to locate, buried under 4 meters of snow, in a ravine 75 meters from the cedar tree. When the snow melted enough in May 1959 to fully excavate the ravine, investigators found the final 4 hikers, and what they found fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. These 4 were better dressed than the others. They were wearing clothing taken from the hikers who had died first. Krivonishenko's torn trousers were found on one of them. This told investigators something important. These 4 had survived long enough to go back and take clothing from the dead. They had been organized. They had been thinking clearly. But then something happened to them too. Lyudmila Dubinina was found facing into a small waterfall, kneeling, her face pressed against a rock. She was 20 years old. The medical examiner noted she had fractured ribs on both sides, a pattern consistent with extreme compressive force. And then the detail that has disturbed people for decades. Her tongue was missing, along with her eyes, part of her lips, and facial tissue. Alexander Zolotaryov had similar rib fractures. So did Nikolai Thibault Brignolel, whose skull fracture was so severe that the examiner compared it to the kind of damage caused by a high-speed car accident. Crucially, there were no external wounds corresponding to these injuries. No cuts, no bruising on the skin. The damage was entirely internal. The Soviet medical examiner's conclusion was that the force required to cause these injuries could not have come from another human being. So what did cause them? The Soviet investigation lasted several months and produced more questions than answers. Investigators tested for radiation and found elevated levels on some of the clothing, specifically on Krivonishenko's trousers and Dubinina's sweater. Not dangerously high, but unexplained. They interviewed the Mansi people living nearby. No connection to the deaths was found. They looked at military activity in the area. The Soviet government was conducting missile tests in the Ural region at the time. This detail was never fully explored in the official record. And then they closed the case. The official conclusion, an unknown compelling force, satisfied no one. The files were classified. The families were told nothing useful, and for 30 years, the truth was buried under Soviet bureaucracy. When the files were finally released after the fall of the USSR, the theories began in earnest. Theory 1, infrasound. Some researchers have proposed that the mountain's particular geography could generate infrasound, low-frequency sound waves below the range of human hearing. Infrasound at certain frequencies is known to cause extreme anxiety, panic, and even hallucinations. It could explain why 9 experienced hikers fled their tent in blind terror with no rational threat present. This theory is plausible but unproven. Theory 2, a military weapons test. The proximity of Soviet missile testing ranges, the radiation on the clothing, and the nature of the internal injuries have led many researchers to conclude that the group was caught in the blast radius or pressure wave of some kind of experimental weapon. The Soviet government, this theory holds, knew exactly what happened and covered it up. Theory 3, a slab avalanche. In 2021, a team of Swiss researchers published a study in the journal Communications Earth and Environment proposing that a specific type of avalanche, a slab avalanche, could explain the injuries. Unlike a conventional avalanche, a slab avalanche involves a dense flat sheet of compacted snow breaking loose. The pressure of such a slab could theoretically produce the kind of internal injuries found on the victims without leaving external marks. The researchers built physical models and ran computer simulations to support this conclusion. Critics, however, point out that there was no evidence of avalanche activity at the site. No disruption of the snow, no debris field, and a slab avalanche does not explain why the hikers cut through the tent and ran downhill rather than digging out, which is standard avalanche survival procedure. Theory 4. A Yeti or unknown creature. This one circulates widely online. The evidence for it is essentially zero. Moving on. Here is what makes the Dyatlov Pass incident genuinely different from most historical mysteries. It's not one unexplained detail. It's several, and they point in different directions. The internal injuries with no external wounds. The radiation on the clothing. The missing facial tissue on Dubinina, which it should be noted was later theorized to be the result of natural decomposition in a flowing stream, which is more plausible but less conclusive than it sounds. The tent slashed from the inside. The footprints showing no signs of running, just walking, calmly, away from the tent, and then abruptly stopping. The burns on their hands from a fire that should have been enough to keep them alive, but wasn't. No single theory accounts for all of it. The slab avalanche explains the injuries, but not the radiation or the calm footprints. The military test explains the injuries and the radiation, but not the exact sequence of events or why the bodies were so spread out. The infrasound explains the panic, but not the injuries at all. And this is what keeps people coming back to this case, 67 years later. Not the mystery of the unknown, but the mystery of the almost known. The sense that the answer is just out of reach. That if one more piece of evidence surfaced, everything would finally make sense. So far, it hasn't. 9 experienced hikers, a classified Soviet investigation, injuries that still don't have a consensus explanation. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the most studied, most debated, and most unresolved mysteries of the 20th century. In 2019, Russian prosecutors actually reopened the case, and in 2020, they announced their conclusion: an avalanche. The families of the victims rejected this conclusion. The researchers who spent decades on the case rejected it, and the files, even today, are not fully public. If you want to go deeper on this case, I've linked the best documentary and the original 2021 Swiss research paper in the description. Next week, we're covering the disappearance of 117 people from an entire colony overnight, with only a single word carved into a post as a clue. If you watched this far, subscribe.